Welcome back to the class. Of course, my name is Robert Greene II. My day job, I'm an assistant professor of history at Claflin University, and at night, I'm of course the lead instructor for the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. Now, as you might recall, last class we covered the beginnings of Reconstruction, featuring our special guest, Vernon. And this evening we're going to finish up Reconstruction. And I was talking to Chris a moment ago before class began about how Reconstruction as an era of American history often gets the short shrift. Usually when we do Reconstruction, whether it's K through 12 or a college level, either we get it at the end of the semester on US history, at the end of the Civil War, or we get it at the beginning of a new semester when people were just settling in. Even for my Civil War and Reconstruction class, it's usually more 60% Civil War and 40% Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction is one of those time periods that I think most Americans are only vaguely aware of. Now, I have to admit the irony of me doing a Reconstruction lecture this week is in the fact that this Thursday I'll be part of a panel discussion for the Organization of American Historians, also about teaching Reconstruction. And one of the things that I found talking to colleagues of mine across the country is that teaching and learning about Reconstruction acquires a special urgency when it's taught in the Deep South, and doubly so, I would argue, when it's taught in South Carolina. Now, as you might recall from last week's class, Reconstruction really has its epicenter in the Palmetto State. So much is happening here in the late 1860s and early 1870s that exemplify what Reconstruction could have been throughout the South. And one of the things you have to understand about the Reconstruction era is that it'd be more accurate to refer to Reconstruction as reconstructions across various southern states and across the country. Reconstruction in South Carolina is not the same as Reconstruction in, say, Georgia, nor is it the same as Reconstruction in, say, Texas. Every southern state has its own unique Reconstruction history, but so much of the narrative about Reconstruction that we're often taught, we often learn about, is about Reconstruction on a regional and national level. Now, this evening, we're going to finish up Reconstruction story in South Carolina and throughout the country, and then we're going to segue into, of course, the Jim Crow era, which actually explains the Odetta song at the beginning of this evening. So, as is always the case with this class, there is a lot for us to cover tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so I want to bring our attention back to where we were last week, because I think it's important for folks to understand, again, what Reconstruction was and what Reconstruction could have been throughout the South and throughout the entire country. Now, many historians today refer to Reconstruction as America's unfinished revolution, as America's second revolution, so on and so forth. And I think when you see images like this one, the one I have up here of the first Black senator representatives in Congress in the early 1870s, these are the kinds of images folks think about when they think about Reconstruction. In fact, I actually have a print of this very same painting in my office at Claflin, which is actually right next to the photograph that Brett so graciously gave me a few years ago of Modjeska Simkins. So you have the Reconstruction one end, the legacy Reconstruction next to it. I'll talk more about that later this semester. But while Black families across the South are able to embrace the fact that they now have politicians in their state capitals in Washington, D.C., there is still a lot going on with Reconstruction that makes the situation very precarious. Now, as you might remember last week, we talked about the rise and fall of the Ku Klux Klan across the South, including in South Carolina. But by the middle of the 1870s, many Americans are beginning to turn their attention away from Reconstruction in the South. This is happening for a variety of reasons, the biggest of which is there is an economic crisis in 1873, known as the Panic of 1873, where many white Northerners who were already on the fence about Reconstruction are beginning to become much more concerned with their own pocketbooks at home. Now, at the same time, across the South, with the collapse of the Klan, you are seeing more white Southerners becoming more and more openly, not just racist towards Black Americans, but more openly anti-Republican, to the point where the Klan is a thing of the past, but instead you have white Southerners now attacking Black Republicans and white Republicans in broad daylight. It is against this backdrop that politicians like Republican Robert Elliott of South Carolina are urging Congress to pass another Civil Rights Act, the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which was basically designed to deal with the issues of public accommodations and other problems that many politicians felt hadn't been adequately dealt with previous civil rights acts. Now, what makes the Elliott debate in Congress so fascinating is that Elliott ends up debating against former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens of Georgia. And the two men have an incredible debate on the floor of Congress about this 1875 Civil Rights Act. Now, I want to briefly show you some of the language that Elliott uses to describe his support for the act in question. And I think this is really important because one of the things you want to understand is that Black Americans from the moment of freedom in the 1860s had a keen understanding of not only what the United States was, but what it could be. And I believe you see some of this in the rhetoric that Robert Elliott actually employs in his debate against Alexander Stephens. So I'm going to show you part of his speech. And this can actually be found via the Zen Education Project, which is a national effort to teach more of these important histories across the country. And we've been fortunate enough to work with them in the past. You have a question?
No, sorry, I was looking for the Wi-Fi.
The what? Oh, it's the.
I'll get it.
You got us. Okay.
Sorry,
Oh, no worries, no worries. So the important thing about Robert Elliott's speech in 1874 is that what he is pushing for is a Civil Rights Act that he believes will not only answer the questions of racism in the here and now, but what he believes is also important to set the stage for full and unabashed citizenship for Black Americans. And so this is at the end of his speech in 1874, quote, "The passage of this bill will determine the civil status not only of the Negro, but of any other class of citizens who may feel themselves discriminated against. It will form the capstone of that temple of liberty begun on this continent under discouraging circumstances, carried on in spite of the sneers of monarchists and the cavils of pretended friends of freedom, until at last it stands in all its beautiful symmetry and proportions, a building the grandest which the world has ever seen, realizing the most sanguine expectations and the highest hopes of those who, in the name of equal, impartial, and universal liberty, laid the foundation stones," end quote. Now, one of the things about Elliott's speech that's also worth noting is that Elliott himself, in arguing against Alexander Stephens, points out that Black Americans were loyal to the Union in a way that many of his constituents were not during the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And so thanks partly to Elliott's efforts and thanks to the Republican Party's efforts as a whole, they were able to get this Civil Rights Act passed in 1874 to go into effect the following year. This is actually the last Civil Rights Act passed by Congress until 1957, which should give you a sense of where the class is going overall when it comes to talking about racism in American life. Now, despite the best efforts of Robert Elliott, Robert Smalls, other politicians in South Carolina and elsewhere, by the mid-1870s, there is a growing sense across the country that Reconstruction may very well be on its last legs. And typically when we teach Reconstruction in schools, we talk about Reconstruction ending in 1877. That's not entirely true. Reconstruction was largely over in other parts of the South by 1874-75. In states like Georgia, for example, Reconstruction had been over since really about 1870. But South Carolina was one of the last holdouts. And I think it's important to understand what that looks like on the ground. Again, part of the story of Reconstruction is not just a story of Black Republicans versus white Democrats, as we often think of it. It's also a story of internal division within the Republican Party in South Carolina and across the South. For example, this gentleman, Daniel Chamberlain, becomes the Republican governor of South Carolina in 1874. And he becomes governor in part because the Republican Party witnesses a split between a moderate wing that's mostly white and a radical wing that is mostly Black. Chamberlain becomes the compromise candidate, and he becomes governor of the state. As part of this reformist faction of the Republican Party, Chamberlain and other white Republicans begin to take seriously the accusations of economic fraud and grift in the government that had been laid against the Republican Party by white Democrats and even by the national media in the mid-1870s. There is this idea, even within South Carolina, that the cost, literal cost of Reconstruction may be too much to bear for the state. At the same time, you're seeing attempts by white Southerners to overturn what is left of Reconstruction across the South. Amongst many historians, this is known as the Mississippi Plan, because it was born in the state of Mississippi. Now, I think it's important to note, by the way, that later this semester we cover the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Chances are you'll see a photograph of a young Black activist in South Carolina holding a sign, basically saying, "Thank God Mississippi, it makes South Carolina look good." But this is an example of how these two states have often been linked at the hip when it comes to white supremacy. Now, the Mississippi Plan as an idea is born in the 1870s as basically a two-pronged assault on small d democracy. One part of the plan involves voter fraud and intimidation, basically finding ways to stuff the ballot box, to create new laws, to disenfranchise Black Americans. That's on the one hand. On the other hand is outright violence against Black voters and their white supporters. By 1875, we'd already seen examples of this in Colfax, Louisiana. Easter Sunday of that year, dozens of Black Americans are murdered by their white counterparts because they were trying to organize the Republican Party in their part of Louisiana. By 1875, folks, Mississippi are starting to deploy this plan to great effect, basically bringing down the Republican government in Mississippi and replacing it with a Democratic one. But the plan to disenfranchise Black voters and to destroy the Republican Party in the South does not just stay in Mississippi. And in fact, it's going to spread across the South until by the end of the decade, you have groups like the Red Shirts in North and South Carolina executing their version of this plan in their states as well. And that actually brings me to 1876. And again, I want to point out that there is a lot that happens in South Carolina that I don't even have time to touch on. I'll give you one very brief story that really shows what political power for Black Americans looks like on the ground in South Carolina. In 1869, there is a baseball game held between teams from Charleston and Savannah in Charleston. The baseball game itself was, before the baseball game begins, a Black band in Charleston plays Dixie for the Savannah team as they're going to the stadium. The Black citizens of Charleston are so utterly incensed that the band is playing Dixie that they have what's called, well, not really a riot per se, but it's referred to as the Charleston baseball riot. The crowd is angered by the playing of Dixie. The game itself is played, and after the game, as was custom in the 1860s, fans walked on the field to talk to the players, talk to each other, play catch, that sort of thing. During this on-the-field interaction between fans and players, the Charleston police began, according to many eyewitness reports, harassing a Black fan of the game. This further incenses the crowd, and it begins was known as the Charleston Baseball Riot of 1869. Purportedly, right after the riot, when the Savannah team leaves the stadium and tries to get back to its hotel, a Black resident of Charleston is heard saying, "You can't do that here in Charleston. This is a Black city," end quote. Eventually, the two teams play again, and I don't have time to get into it, but it becomes a national news story to where the city fathers of Charleston, the governor of South Carolina is saying, we can have a rematch of the baseball game in peace. And then, of course, the band plays Dixie again, and many Black citizens of Charleston are further outraged by this. But what this shows is that on the ground, everything is on a powder keg. There is a lot of uncertainty of how the Reconstruction experiment will go forth. And by 1876, with Reconstruction across the country really falling apart, all eyes turn to South Carolina to see what will happen in the Palmetto State. Now, in 1876, the Republicans are going to run Daniel Chamberlain for governor once again. Folks aren't really excited about him, but they decide he's the best option they have. Sounds kind of familiar, but I digress. And it sounds familiar, I'm just saying. On the other hand, Democrats are uncertain of what they're going to do. Some Democrats want to run a candidate for office. Others are saying, but the Republicans have the governor's mansion. We can work with Chamberlain. Let's try to run for local and legislative offices instead. Just give up on the governor's race. In the summer of 1876, however, there is a confrontation between members of an all-Black militia in Hamburg, South Carolina, and white citizens of that town, which leads to what's known as the Hamburg Riot, or really the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. In essence, the Black militia in Hamburg had, for weeks and months leading up to July 1876, had serious confrontations with the white citizens of Hamburg. Not anything that was too drastic, but there were arguments over how much the Black militia was, quote unquote, respecting the white residents of Hamburg. There's an argument, an altercation on July 4th, 1876 between the Black militia and the white civilians. The following day, go ahead, Brett.
You were looking at me because I was going to say something?
Yes.
Well, actually, I just thought it, Robert. We're very much in tune. I was going to mention that my first knowledge of the Hamburg Massacre was probably in 1970 something, when we printed it at Grow in our magazine, a story by David Bruck that quoted, and the headline was from the New York Times, that was printed, the New York Times headline in 1876. And it said, the headline was, "Not since the time of the pharaohs." And it went on to say, "Has there been such a mass exodus?" And South Carolinians filled trains and left South Carolina. That's why some of our relatives are elsewhere.
Well, and this is an important point, right? That the Hamburg Riot of 1876, it leads to the murder of 5 Black militia members. And after the massacre, many other Black Americans in the area leave Hamburg entirely. Now, I will say, as an Augusta native, Augusta's right across the river from the Hamburg area. This is something I had barely heard of myself growing up. It wasn't until I was older when I heard of the Hamburg Riot of 1876. And they just, I think in the last 10 years or so, put up a marker in the area about the massacre to commemorate what happened in 1876.
And Dr. Greene, wasn't one of the significant elements of that was that Black militia was protecting the Reconstruction?
Right.
And so when they got away with killing them in broad daylight, and like Mr. Tillman was involved there somewhere, right?
Yes.
That it really, because what that was winding down of the protection of Reconstruction in South Carolina.
Well, the very existence of a Black militia was an example of Reconstruction rule in South Carolina. The fact that there was a Black militia to begin with, that was partly because of Reconstruction and partly because of the fact that many white South Carolinians were continuing to boycott the state government. But by 1876, things are changing. And after the Hamburg massacre, where you have white citizens in the area proclaiming this is our time of redemption, using that term redemption that Dr. Burton understandably dislikes immensely, of redemption being a term white Southerners used for the end of Reconstruction and the return of white rule in the South, or really democratic rule in the South. After the Hamburg massacre, Democrats decide we're going to run Wade Hampton III for the governor's seat in South Carolina. Now, Wade Hampton III is a rather interesting fellow, putting aside the sideburns he has in this photograph. But in all seriousness, he served in the Civil War as a general for the Confederacy. And after the Civil War, he is seen as a leading citizen of the state. Folks in the Democratic Party are desperate to get him to run for high office because they believe he's the only guy they can get to actually win. But the thing about Wade Hampton III is that when we tell this story in the history of South Carolina, it's often told as it's Wade Hampton versus Daniel Chamberlain. Hampton wins the election in 1877 after some disputes over who actually won the election in 1876. But there are a couple of things about Hampton's campaign that should be remembered. Number one, even though the Black vote was under siege in the state, again, you have numerous stories of voter fraud across the state. There are some counties that report more votes than actual voters. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod. But despite that, Wade Hampton's campaign is one that's really more paternalistic towards Black voters, saying that if you vote for me, I will safeguard your rights, I'll protect you from the white racists of my own party, so on and so forth. But the second and important part of the Hampton story is this gentleman, Martin W. Gray, who often gets ignored in the larger narrative of Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction. Now, whereas Hampton is the public face of a kinder, gentler Democratic Party in 1876, Martin Gray is the guy on the ground actually leading efforts to intimidate and, if necessary, to murder Black voters across South Carolina. Now, most historical accounts argue that Hampton was not directly aware of Gray's actions on the ground throughout the state during the election season. But what is clear is that Gray, another ex-Confederate general who fought in the Civil War, is instrumental in putting forth the strategy that will ultimately lead to Hampton's victory in that election in November. Right? So while you have Hampton as the public face of a resurgent Democratic Party, it's Martin Gray doing a lot of the legwork on the ground to ensure this happens by whatever means they need to use to make sure it happens. Now, one thing about politics in South Carolina is, as you've already seen this evening, there are numerous politicians from this state who are very well known for their work both for and against democracy. You have your John C. Calhouns and your Wade Hampton III's. And later on, we'll hear about Ben Tillman and Cole Blease as well. But you also have politicians like Robert Smalls who serve as counterexamples, as genuine exemplars of small d democracy in the Palmetto State. Now, I think most South Carolinians are aware of Robert Smalls because of his heroism during the American Civil War. But I actually point out Smalls this evening more so for his political career, most of which actually takes place after the traditional end date of Reconstruction. Now, let's go back for a second to thinking about what Gray and Hampton are trying to do. When the election results come in November of 1876, there is some uncertainty over whether or not Chamberlain or Hampton won. Both men declare victory. Both men claim they are the next governor of South Carolina. At the same time, nationally, the two candidates for president, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican Party, and Samuel Tilden, the Democratic Party, also claimed victory in the national election of 1876. Ultimately, what happens is that both major parties dispute votes from several states, including South Carolina. Now, in the Constitution, there is a mechanism for if someone does not get a majority of electoral votes, it goes to the House. But it's a separate question of what happens if there are certain states whose votes are unaccounted for and are actually up for grabs. It's uncertain as to who won: South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Now, a national commission is set up in early 1877. Keep in mind, the president wasn't inaugurated back then until March. That will determine who actually won the election. And to make a very, very long story short, one that unfortunately I think we can kind of relate to in the here and now, ultimately the two parties agree that, well, we'll announce Hayes as the winner of the national election. But during the back and forth between the two major parties in this commission, it's also decided that South Carolina was actually won by Wade Hampton and not Daniel Chamberlain. Again, there's some debate to this day about who actually won the 1876 election in South Carolina. But what folks do know and acknowledge is that once Hampton becomes governor, the last vestiges of Reconstruction are brought to an end in South Carolina. For example, I mentioned last week that there were Black students and faculty at the University of South Carolina. In 1877, Governor Hampton gives the Black graduates of USC their diplomas, wishes them well, and USC is closed for 3 years. In 1880, when the university reopens, it is once again an all-white institution. Now, if you go to USC's campus today, there is a marker that's in front of the Thomas Cooper Library that notes the years of operation for USC. He just mentions closes 1877, reopens in 1880. Doesn't exactly say why, but this is the reason why it's closed for those 3 years. It's because of the fact that many white South Carolinians were angered that the flagship university actually had Black students and faculty. Now, despite all of this, Black political power still exists in South Carolina, enough to a point where Governor Hampton believes he has to be very careful in how he handles trying to disenfranchise Black voters. An example of the strength, again, is found in Robert Smalls, who was voted to Congress several times in the 1870s and 1880s. And this is despite the fact that Reconstruction is largely over in the South. But there are some historians who argue for the idea of a long Reconstruction, that it actually lasts from arguably 1861, the Port Royal experiment, until 1900, when the last Black politician from the South, George White, leaves Congress. Again, that's kind of up for debate. That's what historians love to do, is debate, argue about things all the time. Trust me on this, I see it every single day. But the important thing to note is that on the ground in South Carolina, there is still some idea of Black power, which is why in the 1880s and especially 1890s, you're seeing efforts by white South Carolinians to break the back of that power as much as possible. Which brings us to our good and dear friend, Ben Tillman, who in 1890 is elected governor of South Carolina. Now, Tillman had already earned a reputation for being on the front lines in the fight against Reconstruction. He actually makes it clear to voters that he was present in Hamburg for the massacre, that he had a role to play in disenfranchising Black voters, and that he was a stalwart defender and supporter of white supremacy. Now, when Tillman becomes governor in 1891, in his inaugural address, he says the following, quote, "The whites have absolute control of the state government, and we intend at any and all hazards to retain it. The intelligent exercise of the right of suffrage is as yet beyond the capacity of the vast majority of colored men. We deny, without regard to color, that all men were created equal. It is not true now and was not true when Jefferson wrote it," end quote. Now, I wanted to quote that passage from his inaugural address in 1891 because it points out how Americans for centuries have argued over the meaning and the ideas inherent even in our foundational documents. And there is a trend, especially among Southern politicians, of dismissing the Declaration of Independence. Tillman does it here. 30 years before this, Alexander Stephens did it in his cornerstone speech, declaring that the Confederacy was a republic that was marked on the ideals of slavery and disenfranchisement. And like Tillman, Stephens also dismissed the Declaration of Independence ideas of all men were created equal. Now, granted, I don't know if I would think of Ben Tillman as an equal debating partner of Thomas Jefferson, but the important thing to note here is that this shows how Tillman, when he's in office as governor, is executing the next part of the Mississippi Plan, trying to find a way to disenfranchise the last group of Black voters in South Carolina. Again, most of Black voting strength in the state of South Carolina is concentrated really in the Low Country, around Charleston, that part of the state. And Tillman's trying to find a way to break it. But this is not just important to Tillman because of issues of racism. Certainly that's a major part of it. But what you're also seeing by the 1880s and 1890s, despite the fact that Reconstruction for the most part was a thing of the past, is you're seeing the rise of a populist movement across the country. Now, in the 1880s, American farmers in the South and the West especially are beginning to feel left behind and left out of a country that is rapidly industrializing and urbanizing at an incredible and fast rate. And many farmers and agrarian laborers throughout the South especially believe that it's time for something to be done to organize the farmers of the country into a new and vibrant political movement. Now, in the South, the populist movement begins with what are called farmers' alliances, where white farmers would band together, they would pool their resources, their funds, their crops, etc., to keep themselves economically afloat. You also have Black counterparts to this as well, called colored farmers' alliances. Now, across the South, the populist movement is really building a two-wing movement, a white and a Black movement. But what you're seeing is that on the ground in states like South Carolina, Georgia, especially North Carolina, you're seeing these Black and white movements starting to work together on the ground level. For example, gentleman in this photograph you see here, Tom Watson, was a politician from Georgia. He was a major leader of the populist movement in the 1880s and especially 1890s. He actually wins several elections to Congress from Georgia based in part on building a biracial coalition in that state. North Carolina would see a populist movement that would have both Black and white supporters. In Texas, you see the populist movement also galvanizing what was left of the Black vote in the post-Reconstruction period. In South Carolina, much of the Black support for the populist movement is actually centered in and around Lower Richland, where the residents there who still have their land and their property from the Land Commission are becoming some of the major leaders of the Black wing of the populist movement. Of course, in South Carolina, the problem is that the white wing of that movement is represented primarily by good old Ben Tillman. So the potential for a biracial alliance there is not quite fulfilled. But I highlight the populists because in the Modjeska school, one of the things we want you all to understand is how there are examples from American history of biracial and multiracial coalition building. This is not just a new thing that gets debated and argued about on left-wing websites every 2 years or so. It is instead a fact of American history that there have been numerous attempts at building these coalitions, and often they succumb to internal division, to political defeat at the ballot box, and so forth. The populists are a unique example of what could have been, just like Reconstruction 20 years before. I want to actually read to the class a brief passage from a book that was just re-released last year. It's a book by a Black journalist and intellectual named T. Thomas Fortune. He's a gentleman who's often in the shadow of Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, who were his contemporaries. But Fortune ran the New York Age. He was an ardent activist. He was one of the first leading Black Americans to call for a break with the Republican Party in the late 19th century. And he wrote a book called Black and White: Land, Labor, and Politics in the South. And Fortune's book, released in 1884, presented this really radical idea that if Black and white farmers in the South banded together, they could be a powerful political force. Let me read you something from the end of the book. Now, this is actually just as the populists are getting off the ground. Go to this as we start to discuss the Constitution of 1895. He wrote, this is again 1884. As I have said elsewhere, the future struggle in the South will be not between white men and Black men, but between capital and labor, landlord and tenant. Already the cohorts are marshaling to the fray. Already the forces are mustering to the field at the sound of the slogan. The same battle will be fought upon Southern soil that is in preparation in other states, where the conditions are older in development, but no more deep-seated, no more pernicious, no more blighting upon the industries of the country and the growth of the people. Now, again, that's T. Thomas Fortune in 1884, pointing out that in his estimation, and again, Fortune was born into slavery, by the way, in 1856 in Florida. So he experienced the end of slavery and the beginning of Reconstruction and the collapse of Reconstruction. But Fortune felt that for Black Americans to achieve full equality, they were going to have to work alongside white Americans to do so. Now, one thing about Fortune is that later in life, he will become a stalwart ally of Booker T. Washington, mainly because many historians believe Fortune needed help from Washington to keep the New York Age afloat financially, and he eventually becomes more of an accommodationist. But you see the young T. Thomas Fortune is presenting a very idealistic view of how things should be in the South, that he sees it as a battle between capital and labor. A biracial fight that everyone in the South, he believed, had a shared stake in. But that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language, that kind of ideology was anathema to Ben Tillman and his allies, who by 1895 and after the end of Tillman's second term had convened a new constitutional convention in South Carolina designed to really overturn the radical victory of the 1868 Constitution. Now, again, Tillman and his allies understand that they cannot outright say in the Constitution, we are going to disenfranchise Black voters. Recall that the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and the 15th guaranteed the right to vote to Black men. Or really, to be more accurate, it made it clear that the vote could not be taken away from you based on race or creed or that sort of thing. And so Tillman and his allies at the convention in 1894-95 followed the same example of their compatriots in Mississippi and other Southern states in the 1890s, building a new state constitution that will disenfranchise many voters in South Carolina, and not just Black voters either. Now, if you go back and look at the records from that convention, one of the things that Tillman's allies are worried about is, will our new laws disenfranchise a large number of white voters as well? The answer is yes, it does. And that's because of two reasons. You have the implementation of literacy tests on a local county level. Basically, if you can read a passage given to you by the local county registrar, you vote. If you can't read it, and that's too bad, you can't vote. Now, with the literacy test, what you see across the South is that some registrars will just turn a blind eye to white citizens who can't pass the exam. But for Black counterparts, they find that even college-educated Black men, later on Black women, can pass literacy tests and they'll be told, oh, you didn't pass it. And basically it comes down to whose word will be believed, the Black citizen or the White County registrar. But the more damaging part of this new state constitution is the continued use of the poll tax. Now, I've joked a few times in this class about the importance of reading your Constitution. And I would actually make an argument that one of the most glossed over amendments to the Constitution is the 24th, which was passed in the 1960s, which banned the poll tax. We kind of ignore that amendment because it was implemented during the Civil Rights Movement, and it kind of gets forgotten about in the face of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. But there's a reason why activists were pushing for an end to the poll tax nationally. The poll tax becomes a serious impediment to voting rights across the South, especially, but not just for Black people. How the poll tax worked was very simple. You have an election in, say, November. However, the poll tax is often due in April or May of that same year. Many poorer farmers across the South have a difficult time making ends meet, especially in the 1890s, in the aftermath of yet another massive depression starting in 1893. So you're a farmer, say you're farming out in Richland County, or you're farming out in West Columbia, or you're farming in Orangeburg, or wherever you are in South Carolina. And you have one of two options. And this is if you're white. I'm not even talking like you're a Black farmer. If you're a white farmer, you're thinking, well, I can pay my poll tax, or I can buy some much needed items for my family at home, but I can't do both. This is a decision, a choice being made by many South Carolinians. And keep in mind that there are quite a few South Carolinians who are farming who are also sharecroppers, who are having to lease all their tools, their equipment, the very house they live in, the land they're working off of, from an owner of the owner of the land that they're working on. This is not an easy decision. And you're seeing this being repeated all across the South, to the point where voter registration and voter participation in elections in the South drops to a dramatic post-Reconstruction low. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, in fact, the least democratic part of the country, without question, is the South. Basically becomes a one-party state after 1900 because of the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of Black voters and also hundreds of thousands of white voters as well. Here's some additional provisions from that new 1895 Constitution. To actually vote, you also have to own at least $300 worth of property, have to pass a literacy test, pay a poll tax at least 6 months before the election. And also, just a coincidence, the Constitution also points out if you were convicted of crimes of bigamy, burglary, arson, or robbery, you couldn't vote either. When I told my dad earlier this afternoon that I was teaching about the rise of Jim Crow segregation and the rise of voter disenfranchisement, he joked with me, "Oh, so you're teaching about right now?" And I laughed. But this is actually something that I want to point out. My students at Claflin say the same thing when I talk about this Constitution, and I think this is one of the reasons why a school like the Modjeska School is so important. I don't like to say that history rhymes or repeats itself, but it does get remixed from time to time. And I think, again, we always have to keep in mind that the very foundational ideals of democracy in our country are always on a very precarious slope. And I think this Constitution is proof positive of how this has been a problem in the South. It's also a problem across the country. Yes.
I want to put a pin in it, Dr. Greene, for people that aren't as smart as you are, myself included. When I understood that Tillman said repeatedly, I've done all I can under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to deny Black people the right to vote. What he was also saying is all he could do was to hurt people across the board. And so it was really a very de jure time that we're still living in when white working people are thrown under the bus of racism. And that as recently as the time when the first Black person won a seat in Fairfield County in the House since the 1890s, Fairfield's 60% Black and has been since then. There were no Black representatives in Fairfield County. The county council, the representative that won before Annie McDaniels was Boyd Brown. His father was the chair of the county council, and his uncle was the senator, all in one family. And that the senator was in a runoff with one of our members, Mike Fanning. And the senator, the Democratic white senator, was calling people in the Democratic Party, telling them, you know, Mike Fanning's married to a Black woman. So to him, race was more important than the party. So that this is something that was really set in de jure fashion to keep people stupid, minimally adequate educations, etc. And I just think that I'm sorry, Dr. Greene, it was just this point that I learned that made sense to me. I thought I'd share with people that aren't quite as smart as others.
That's really go ahead, please.
One more thing about Ben Tillman that I like to point out, and I get excoriated for it sometimes, that it's important that we see our villains not as unique, but as humans that make decisions to do that. And so when I found out that Tillman was quite the gardener, and that when he had meetings with people, he would take them to the botanical garden, beautiful botanical gardens in Washington, D.C. And he was quite fond of stealing plants and taking them back to Edgefield. And so that was just something about him that I really appreciated, Robert. So, and in 1907, I found this out when I realized that money's corrupted our politics, right, as well as racism. Did everybody know the Tillman Act? 1907? Ben Tillman sponsored an act that was just repealed that prevented politicians, incumbent federal politicians, from taking campaign contributions from corporations or banks. The Tillman Act. And so that's that kind of that populist element of him, where he liked plants and didn't like big money.
Right, exactly.
Or Black people.
Steve, I saw your hand raised.
I wanted to ask, when you're talking about the 24th Amendment that outlawed the poll taxes, what year was that passed?
The 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964.
That's kind of recent.
Just a tad. Yeah. Well, and this is the thing is, I think part of the reason why it's forgotten about is that it passed the same year as the Civil Rights Act passed. But there is a reason why civil rights activists were pushing for the end of the poll tax right up until 1962, 63, 64, because it was still in effect up to that point. Now, I think this is actually an interesting segue to talking about the Jim Crow era in South Carolina. And I want to start off by talking about two speeches given around the same time, or at least in the same year. One by Robert Smalls and one by Booker T. Washington. Now, the Booker T. Washington speech, I think, is the better known one. This is of course, the Atlanta Compromise address that he gives in Atlanta during the Cotton States Exposition of 1895. And I'll just pull up a quick image of the speech here, just for a hot second. The Cotton States Exposition was the so-called New South's way of saying to the world, we are open for business once again. The New South being a catchphrase that's used every generation in the South to say, we aren't as bad as our forefathers. In the case of the New South of the 1880s and 90s, it was his way of saying, the South is now going to industrialize, the South is going to modernize, and sorry about that Civil War thing, let's do that in the past, right? Now, Booker T. Washington gives his speech in September 1895, and it's seen as a speech where the torch is passed from Frederick Douglass, who passes away that same year, to Booker T. Washington, being the new Black person who's seen as the representative of his people. And if you look at the speech, Washington is giving a speech that addresses concerns of his era. For example, Washington talks a bit about the importance of Black Americans being given the ability to compete in the economic arena at the expense of the political arena. So, for example, he has this line up here about Reconstruction, where he says that Reconstruction was a mistake. Quote, ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, the Reconstruction era, we began at the top instead of at the bottom. That a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill. That the political convention or stump speaking had more attractions than starting a dairy farm or truck garden, end quote. Washington even points out to his audience, again, a reflection of the era, that Black labor in the South was a useful balm and a useful antidote to the problem of unionization and immigration. So this is the part of the speech that kind of gets ignored. He said here, to those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits for the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I will repeat what I say to my own race. Cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down among the 8 millions of Negroes whose habits you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when to have proved treacherous meant the ruin of all your firesides. And so what he's alluding to there is that in the 1890s, it's an era of growing immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to the United States, where the industrializing North and Midwest is seeing more immigration from Europe. And Washington's saying, well, in the South, we don't need immigrants to be a pliant labor force. We have 8 million Negroes already here to do that same job. So that's the speech that I think most folks are familiar with. The speech that Washington gives that for many historians is seen as basically his surrendering of civil rights to the white South. But that same year, Robert Smalls of South Carolina gives a speech at the Constitutional Convention, which is very much the exact opposite of Washington's speech, where Washington basically gives up on the dream of small d democracy. Smalls fights for it with every ounce of his being. So the Washington speech is given in September of 1895. This speech is given a bit earlier that same year. Really, I think in 1894 is when this speech is given. But what Smalls says is that, in essence, the Constitution that they were writing was a mistake. Amongst other things, Smalls gives this brief resuscitation of Black history in the country and in South Carolina. And then he says the following. Since Reconstruction times, 53,000 Negroes have been killed in the South, and not more than 3 white men have been convicted and hung for these crimes. I want you to be mindful of the fact that the good people of the North are watching this convention upon this subject. I hope you will make a constitution that will stand the test. I hope that we may be able to say when our work is done, that we have made as good a constitution as the one we are doing away with. That, of course, being the Constitution of 1868. Now, in the rest of the speech, Smalls is talking about the efforts that have already taken place to disenfranchise Black voters. But he ends his speech with this, because he warns South Carolinians that if this Constitution is passed, it could lead to, again, as Brett noted, an exodus of Black people from the state to go elsewhere. Some morning, you may wake up to find that the bone and sinew of your country is gone. The Negro is needed in the cotton fields and the low country rice fields. And if you impose too hard conditions upon a Negro in this state, there will be nothing else for him to do but to leave. What then will you do about your phosphate works? No one but a Negro can work them, the mines that pay the interest on your state debts. I tell you, the Negro is the bone and sinew of your country, and you cannot do without him. I do not believe you want to get rid of the Negro. Else, why did you impose a high tax on immigration agents who might come here to get him to leave? Now, Mr. President, President of the convention, we should not talk one thing and mean another. We should not deceive ourselves. Let us make a constitution that is fair, honest, and just. Let us make a constitution for all the people, one we will be proud of and all children will receive with delight. Of course, that is not what happened. Instead, the Constitution of 1895, as noted a moment ago, was one that disenfranchised many thousands of voters, black and white, in South Carolina. And it was an example of a growing trend of disenfranchisement across the entire South, one that was largely acquiesced to by the North. Very quickly, before I really get back into this presentation, I do want to note one thing. That 5 years before these speeches were given in 1890, Congress had a major debate over what was called the Federal Elections Reform Bill, or in the South, known as the Force Bill. In essence, it would have been a bill that would have given the federal government the authority to send election monitors into the South if there were reports of voter fraud and intimidation. The Republican Party pushed for this vote in Congress before ultimately tabling it to instead focus on economic matters that were affecting the West, silver and gold standard, and the like. That was the last time Congress would deal with the issue of voting rights until essentially 1940s and World War II, which we'll discuss in the weeks to come. And certainly was the last time we discussed it until the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. Now, I think there is something alarming about much of what we've discussed this evening, which is you've seen that issues about voting rights, voter fraud, and voter intimidation were known to folks across the country, and yet little to nothing was done about it for basically a century. I point out to my students that both of my grandmothers, by the way, my grandmother on my mom's side turned 87 years old today. I told her she was a nice 21 years old now, but I told my students, my grandparents couldn't vote until they were in their 30s or 40s because of things like the laws that were on the books across the South. My mother just last week told me a story, just kind of offhand, of going to a segregated all-Black movie theater in Augusta, Georgia, as a kid. That was just a thing you did. And so, as Steve has already pointed out, a lot of this stuff isn't dealt with or resolved until fairly recently. And that's what makes learning about the Jim Crow era so important. It was not that long ago.
Dr. Greene,
yes,
if I may, before we move on, this is a really important, very distilled issue that impacted me greatly. The Atlanta Compromise, when Booker T. Washington and Du Bois squared off. Du Bois squared off with souls of Black folks, and there's a first chapter takes Booker T. down. But what I learned much later in life after knowing it happened, in terms of working with Modjeska, was the limb she went out on, the danger she faced. Her mother was a founding member with Du Bois in the Niagara movement. And Modjeska was not an accommodationist. That was the term that was applied to Booker T. Booker T wanted to get the best out of the status quo he could get. What's the best deal we can get? And that what gave rise to the civil rights movement, where the laws were, they were grudgingly accommodating rights of people of color. All along, from the beginning of the Niagara movement and Modjeska's organizing and the Boys' organizing, they wanted human rights that were across the board, regardless of color, that had to do with education and healthcare, the same things we want. And so that dichotomy, when you explain to people the difference between civil rights and human rights, helps people understand that, well, that human rights stuff is kind of threatening to the people that own all the money. You mean you want real equality, economic equality, educational equality? And so that was something that was really the cutting edge back then. That's why we don't know it. When we get up to later, closer to our days today, now, you'll see that every time that the black and white people start working together, like Du Bois and Simkins said we've got to do, the hammer comes down. So anyway, another pen. I like to put pen in the simple thoughts.
Well, and I think to your point, that's actually one reason why I mentioned T. Thomas Fortune's book, Black and White. It was only republished in the last year. It was kind of one of the forgotten texts from Black Americans in the late 19th century, where you have a class of Black intellectuals trying to come up with different methods by which to deal with the onrush of segregation across the South and really anti-Black racism across the country. And what Fortune was pointing to was that this issue of racism was really part and parcel of a larger issue dealing with the battle between labor and capital, something that Du Bois will also later write about extensively in works like Black Reconstruction in America. But what you're seeing in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are Americans across the color line trying to come to grips with the kind of country they're living in the post-Reconstruction period. Oftentimes, we think of American history as really hitting a fulcrum point with the Civil War, but I think I and other historians argue it's really more so the Reconstruction period that's the turning point. That's the point in history at which things could have gone a number of different directions. And some would argue that in the South especially went in the worst possible direction it could have gone. Now, the story of the Jim Crow era, I actually want to tell by starting off with a story about two Black politicians who are really important to the state in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one of them, of course, is George W. Murray. Now, I mentioned earlier on that Robert Smalls was winning office from the state in the 1880s. What ends up happening is that the bulk of the Black vote is really concentrated in one district, 7th District of South Carolina. And what you see happen is that Robert Smalls, George Murray, and Thomas Miller, who you see here, these three men often find themselves fighting each other for the Republican nomination and then going on to general election and winning based on the strength of the Black vote. By the early 1890s, both Murray and Miller had gone to Congress from that district in South Carolina. And Miller, he defeats Murray in 1892, and he later goes on, after losing another bid against Murray in 94, he becomes the first president of the Colored Normal, Industrial, Agricultural, and Mechanical College of South Carolina, known today as South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Now, for those who don't know, the early history of SC State is very much tied to the history of Claflin University at the same time. In 1872, a sort of mechanical and agricultural portion of Claflin is assigned those duties to teach Black citizens of the state certain vocational needs and skills. By 1894-95, it's decided to make that a separate institution from Claflin, in large part because by the 1890s, the federal government has passed a new land grant college act that will create land grant colleges across the South. Now, if you know anything about land grant universities, the ones we know best are those that are now the Big Ten, like the University of Michigan, Ohio State, et cetera. In the South, however, to fulfill the requirements of creating land grant universities, the South had to create both white and Black land grant institutions. And so in South Carolina, the Black land grant institution was SC State. Now, we've already mentioned what's happening on a state level with segregation and racism. But it's always important to note the national context for this as well. Now, in the early 1890s, as more and more Southern states were passing laws to disenfranchise Black voters, there are folks in the North who note this with alarm, but feel there's very little they can do about it. Again, the national appetite to really intervene on the issue of race is largely gone. To show this point, I'll read you a passage from The Nation magazine from 1877. The Nation wrote, quote, "The Negro will disappear from the field of national politics. Henceforth, the nation, as a nation, will have nothing more to do with it." That was in 1877. And I love reading that passage because I've actually written for the Nation several times, so go figure. But by 1896, the national mood on race has turned decidedly against the glory days of the Reconstruction era and the abolitionist movement, and instead sees everything, or just about everything, through the lens of white supremacy. Now, I want to be clear about this. When we're thinking about the national mood on race, that also cannot be divorced from the global mood on race in this time period as well. The 1890s is the heyday of European imperialism. Most of the world is under the direct or indirect domination of European powers and the United States. And so that attitude on race is also reflected in national and local laws on race and racism. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision is an example of this. Now, Homer Plessy was a person in Louisiana who got on a train car and was told that he was in the wrong section. He should go to the colored section. Now, the thing about Homer Plessy is that we don't have any actual photos of Homer Plessy. So if you do a Google search for Homer Plessy, you will not find any photos of him. Those are not Homer Plessy, I can assure you of that. But secondly, every description we have of Plessy written during his era about the man says that he could have passed for white if he chose to do so. But he insisted in the Plessy v. Ferguson case that he was a Negro and that he wanted the law to reflect the fact that these ideas about race were actually foolish. That if he could have passed for white, then what does that mean about race in Louisiana and across the country? However, the Supreme Court, you see here, ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that the idea of separate but equal was constitutional. Basically, in the court case, Plessy's lawyers argue that creating a separate train car for Negroes was unconstitutional under the 13th and 14th Amendments. The Supreme Court argued, well, as long as the accommodations are equal, separation is totally fine. After this, the floodworks opened on the creation of separate schools, separate train cars. Everything in the South becomes separated by race, with the understanding that in theory, those accommodations would be equal. That, of course, was not the case. Now, after Plessy v. Ferguson, you really have the last vestiges of Reconstruction being dismantled. For example, in North Carolina in 1898, there is a coup d'etat against the city government of Wilmington, a government that was built on a biracial coalition of Republicans and populists. The Wilmington insurrection, as it is known today, led to not only the overthrowing of a Republican government in Wilmington, but also the exodus of thousands of Black residents from Wilmington to other parts of the country. In fact, the Wilmington insurrection or Wilmington massacre was such a disaster for the Black community that as late as the 1970s, Black residents of Wilmington still spoke of the insurrection in hushed and fearful tones, worried that the same thing could happen again generations later. Now, this insurrection happens and the nation is well aware of it. And nothing is done to stop it. Again, white Democrats in North Carolina decide to take up arms to overthrow their city government. And the president of the United States and other authorities stand aside and do nothing. The same is true of the murder of Fraser Baker, who was a postmaster in Lake City, South Carolina, who happened to be Black. Now, by the 1890s, you're seeing the beginnings of massive numbers of lynchings across the South and across the country. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Baker family is a unique case of how insidious lynching actually was. Now, the people of Lake City did not appreciate having a Black postmaster general, and they repeatedly begged the president of the United States to replace him with somebody else who was white. President William McKinley refused to do so, and in 1897, the Baker family was actually attacked by a white mob in their own home. Now, what happened in the weeks leading up to this attack was that Fraser Baker actually made his home into the post office for Lake City, because many white residents refused to go to the post office to pick up their mail from a Black person. So he was doing his best to help people in the area who still want to get their mail. But eventually he and his family were attacked in the middle of the night, and Baker himself and one of his daughters was killed in the ensuing shootout. The rest of the family, as you can see here, actually flees from Lake City and goes to Boston, never to return to South Carolina. And again, this is an artist rendering of the attack that evening. One of the things that folks note about this particular murder is that it should have triggered a federal investigation, because the man who was killed was a federal employee. And the McKinley administration makes some brief overtures to investigate the crime. Eventually, some folks are put on trial for it, but no one is ever actually convicted of the murder of Fraser Baker. And this is actually a marker that's in Lake City today that shows how this story is now portrayed there in Lake City. But I point out the lynching of Fraser Baker because it is just an example of how what you're seeing in the 1890s is a new wave of intimidation and outright murder against Black Americans throughout the South, and actually throughout the country, because you have lynchings outside the South as well. But the problem of lynching is one that really becomes a stain on the South in particular. Let me give you some numbers. As far as we know,
whereabouts in Lake City is that marker? I know Lake City.
you know, I'm not exactly sure of where precisely.
You don't know if it's on Main Street where?
Not quite.
Church.
Could be that number 2136 at the top. That might help you look at it.
Yeah, I think if you do a search for it online, I'll tell you the exact location of it. Now, as far as we know, in terms of numbers of lynchings, and again, this number is updated every year to discover more information, more evidence. We believe that between the years 1882 and 1968, there were approximately 4,743 people who were lynched across the United States. Of those, about 3,446 were Black. In South Carolina, we know of at least 156 Black Americans were lynched during that time period. The state with the highest number of lynchings was Mississippi, with 539. Now, I say at least, and I say approximately for one very simple, well, two reasons. Number one, as many lynchings as we know of, there are many more that may never have been reported or remarked upon. But more importantly, when you're thinking about the use of murder and violence in the South, you can't just begin and end with lynchings. For every lynching, there are many more Black Americans who simply disappeared. There are many who were forced to flee for a variety of reasons. the true cost of lynchings and other attempts at murder and intimidation in this era may never be fully calculated or realized or understood. For example, you have Black Americans in the South who are accused of a number of crimes, who flee north and never return. There is actually, in the early 20th century, you have a repeat of the Fugitive Slave Act era, where you have northern states refusing to send Blacks back south to stand trial because they are convinced Black Americans cannot get a fair trial anywhere in the Deep South. You have numerous examples of Black Americans being murdered across the South for a wide variety of infractions, so to speak, quote unquote. Things as simple as looking at a white person the wrong way, or not addressing a white person in the proper fashion, with the proper deference, that sort of thing. There are many stories of that happening that lead to the deaths of Black men and women across the South as well. Again, the full death toll may never be known, but what is certain is that lynchings become the most visible and violent marker of white supremacy and anti-Black intimidation in this time period. Now, what does that look like on the ground? Well, for one thing, you have numerous instances of lynchings being announced ahead of time, where, for example, newspapers will run stories saying, like you see here, John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob, Negro jerking and so on, it's burning our nears. These things were announced ahead of time. They were made into full-scale picnics, parties, where a person would be captured by a white mob. They would be sent to some place to be hung. The lynching itself could take a variety of forms. There were many instances of lynchings where a person was hung and then shot. And oftentimes it was a Black man also castrated. In 1899, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, who just mentioned a moment ago, was living in Atlanta during the lynching of Sam Hose. And Hose's body was not only destroyed, parts of it were put on display in drugstores in Atlanta. When Du Bois went to the office of the Atlanta Constitution, a local newspaper, to give an editorial condemning the lynching, he passed by one of these stores and looked in the window and realized he was looking at charred body parts. At that point, Du Bois realized that being a scholar and academic was not going to be enough to change the South for the better. You even have the use of lynching photographs as postcards, where folks across the country would mail folks a postcard. On one side would have "Wish You Were Here," on the other you would have a photograph of a lynching. Now, the post office often refused to send these postcards. There was a certain point it just said, we're not going to send any more of these. These were too beyond the pale for us. But there are museums across the country, especially the Jim Crow Museum in Michigan, that still have some of these postcards left over from this era. Again, I don't show this for the sake of titillation or amusement. I show this because this gives you a sense of what life was like for Black people in the United States. The fact that you could be murdered at any moment, and the moment of absolute horror in your life could be turned into a postcard and a celebration for someone else. These were the forces that Black men and women were up against in the South. Now, in South Carolina, what you see is that Black Americans were trying to build upon the institutions they had. For example, you have places like Claflin that are still in operation. This is actually the library they had at that time. This is today the Arthur Rhodes Museum at Claflin. It was once the school's library. You, of course, have folks like W.E.B. Du Bois pushing back against Booker T. Washington and assault of Black folk, making an argument that fighting for Black civil and political rights was as important as fighting for Black economic rights and economic self-sufficiency. In fact, Du Bois, and so the Black folk, argues that you cannot have one, business interests and economic self-sufficiency, without the other, voting rights and civil rights. Also, if you've not read Souls of Black Folk, I would highly recommend doing so, because a great deal of the book is still very relevant for today. For example, there are sections in the book about the value of a quality education. There are sections in the book about the role and purpose of a Negro, or today Black, university. There are other sections in the book about the need for Black Americans across the South to band together and to really assert their rights, not only as citizens, but as human beings. Now, granted, Du Bois will call for things like the talented 10th, that a sort of a vanguard of Black Americans to lead the race forward. But it's important to note that Du Bois would later basically refuse that idea. Initially, in his younger days, as you see here, Du Bois is working in very much a Victorian mindset, that he's saying that there has to be a vanguard of leaders for the race. That's going to change dramatically the next 30 to 40 years, especially after Du Bois helps to found the Niagara movement and later the NAACP. And he's going to become much more certain that massive grassroots organizing will also be important. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks or so.
The talented 10th.
Yes, which, you know, that's one of the ideas Du Bois is criticized for today, but let's just say this. Du Bois, he lives to be 95 years old. He actually passes away the day before Martin Luther King gives the I Have a Dream speech, in 1963. So Du Bois wrote Souls of Black Folk in 1903. He had about 60 years to change his mind on something, and he does repeatedly. Du Bois literally saw it all. Oh, by the way, this is a shameless plug here.
He was the first Black PhD at Harvard. Right?
Yes, he was.
So he was pretty smart back then.
Yeah, although Du Bois getting a PhD at Harvard, it's important to note that while he was at Harvard, he also spent a couple years at the University of Berlin in the 1890s. And he told a joke later on that when he told folks at Berlin he was a Harvard student, they were like, so? They didn't care. They were Germans. They were like, hey, Harvard, who cares about Harvard? But actually, Du Bois's time in Germany also shapes him, because he begins to develop some of his ideas about the folk. Again, the book is known as Souls of Black Folk, right? In Germany, you have this term Volk, right? The people. And when he writes Souls of Black Folk, among the biggest champions of the book is German philosopher and social scientist Max Weber, who actually translates Souls of Black Folk into German in the early 20th century. What you see, though, is that Du Bois and other Black leaders in the United States are trying to come up with different strategies to deal with segregation and Jim Crow laws. On the flip side, coming back to South Carolina for a second, you have folks like Richard Carroll, who basically becomes the Booker T. Washington of South Carolina. He is seen by many as an accommodationist, and even Booker T. Washington himself actually praises Carroll. Carroll really emphasizes Black self-uplift. He emphasizes economic self-sufficiency, and he downplays ideas of agitation for voting rights. Now, again, the timing of this is very important. Carroll comes into prominence in the early 20th century, shortly after the 1895 Constitution is put into effect. You can make an argument that Carroll and other Black Southerners like him read the tea leaves and they see where things are going. Now, what's interesting about Washington, let me go back to him for a second. Washington at this time was beloved by many Americans, white and Black. However, folks like W.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter of Boston, other Black leaders were very critical of Washington. Behind the scenes, Washington does fund legal cases that fight against voting intimidation and voting rights abuses. But that wouldn't be known about Washington until decades after his death. He's doing that mostly in secret. But folks like Washington and Carroll are arguing that Black Americans need to basically lay low on the issue of civil political and human rights. And so conditions are a bit better. Of course, Du Bois is saying we can't wait to fight for these things right now. Now, Black life in the state of South Carolina, of course, includes basic everyday needs, includes the need for education, for schools, for hospitals. Of course, folks like Matilda Evans just recently received the Marker of her own in Columbia, were instrumental in helping to build a Black middle class in South Carolina. Evans herself, a medical professional, really leads the way in providing medical care for Black Americans in Columbia and throughout South Carolina. Now, of course, this actually relates to our school because Modjeska Simkins herself will later become the leader of a statewide public office that dealt with public health and tuberculosis in the 1930s. I'll look for that in a bit. And of course, as Brett mentioned, Modjeska's mother was one of the founders of the Niagara movement. Later on, you have Archibald Grimke of the Grimke family, who helps to found the NAACP in 1909. So while the state of South Carolina is experiencing an era of racial reaction, you do have folks within the state trying to navigate and find some way to make space for, if not full-blown Black political power, at least to build the infrastructure for these fights down the road. Now, again, one thing about the Grimke family that's interesting to note is that the Grimke family has both a white part of the family and a Black part of the family. You may recall a few weeks ago, we talked about the Grimke sisters. That family also had a Black part of it that the white part did not really speak to very often. Now, Archibald Grimke and other Black Grimkes in the family really keep alive the legacy of abolition and racial progressivism for decades, far longer than the white side of the family actually does. There's a wonderful book about the Grimkes, I'll put it in the chat later on this evening, that talks about both sides of that family tree and how at a certain point, they don't really interact with each other. The name Grimke, however, still has some cachet in the early 20th century as a name that meant abolitionism and racial progress. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, and Brett also mentioned this too, this constant threat of Black Americans leaving the South and going elsewhere in the country. Now, you've always had Black Americans moving to other parts of the country. In the 1880s, you had the exoduster movement going to Kansas, for example. You also have Black Americans moving to major cities in the South. But by 1915, you start to see Black Americans moving up north and also out west in what comes to be known as the Great Migration. Now, I like showing this map because part of what makes the Great Migration so fascinating is that where Black Americans go to in the north depends on where you're leaving from in the south. So, for example, if you look at this map, you see that you have mass numbers of Black Americans leaving Alabama, Mississippi, and going up to Chicago, for example. Whereas if you look on the East Coast, you have a lot of Black Americans leaving South Carolina and going up to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, even as far north as Boston. To this day, in fact, there are actual clubs in northern cities that are basically the descendants of folks who made this Great Migration journey. And the clubs are based on where they left from in the South. So you might have clubs of folks of South Carolinians who were up north or Alabamans up north, so on and so forth. But what you're seeing with the Great Migration is that Black Americans are beginning to vote with their feet. If they cannot achieve their dreams of prosperity and freedom in the South, they will go elsewhere to do it. Now, keep in mind, the North is not exactly paradise on a number of different levels. But what Black Americans are doing is deciding that There are industrial jobs up north they can get, they can acquire. They'll have the right to vote in the north, they move up there. There are a number of factors that lead to Black Americans moving up north and also out west during the Great Migration.
Robert, I think it's a coincidence that that's the railroad tracks.
Right.
On those routes.
Exactly. That's another big part of it too, is that they're just taking the railroads up north. They're going wherever they can get, and then just wherever they stop is where they end up. One interesting point about this story, by the way, is that there is a great series on Epic now, MGM network, what have you, called The Godfather of Harlem. It's based on the true story of a Harlem gangster in the 1960s, Bumpy Johnson, whose family was from South Carolina. In fact, as a gangster in the show, he has a front company that I believe is called Palmetto Movers, because again, his folks are from South Carolina. Thought that was kind of fun. Now, I know we're almost out of time here, but I want to make a couple more key points and then we'll finish up for this evening. The early 20th century is an era where you're seeing numerous social movements really achieve their apex. Among those is the suffrage movement, which by the 19-teens has achieved some victories on a state level, but is still fighting for full voting rights for women across the country. Now, in South Carolina, one of the best known suffrage rights champions is Nita Pulitzer, who was also a famed photographer, but is best known to history for her work on suffrage in South Carolina. Now, one thing to note about the suffrage movement in the Deep South is that it runs into impediments that their counterparts in the North and the West don't have to deal with, namely with the issue of racism. There are some suffragettes who push for the right to vote for women, are making an argument that if you grant white women, in particular, the right to vote, it can counter the Black male vote in the South. Now, this is not an argument made across the country, but we do see it time and again in the South. Despite that, Southern states are really the last states to get on board with suffrage rights. In fact, when the 19th Amendment of the Constitution is ratified in 1920, most of the South is really the big stumbling block to that amendment being ratified. Most of the states do not formally ratify the actual amendment until the late 20th century. Tennessee actually is the state that gets the amendment over the top in 1920, but it only comes after the women's suffrage movement uses American entry into the Great War to argue that if we're going to fight for democracy abroad, we should practice some of it here at home for women as well. And again, this photograph here actually shows that suffrage protests during the Great War, during World War I. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And again, you see the women in this photograph, by the way, they were actually wearing sashes that say what universities they attended. So what they're also showing is that women are acquiring more education than before, acquiring more opportunities than ever before, but they still cannot vote. Also, the early 20th century is the heyday of the Socialist Party in the United States. And we tend to kind of gloss over this part in US history, it's just a coincidence. But in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, after Republicans and Democrats, there is a real argument to be made that the Socialist Party had real power in the US. The Socialists were sending folks to Congress, they were sending folks to city councils across the country. In Milwaukee, the Socialists were actually in control and practiced what was called sewer socialism, where they addressed the everyday needs of folk in Milwaukee. And the Socialist Party across the country really believed they were on the cusp of obtaining more power in the 19-teens. There's actually an image, and I cannot find it right now, but our friend of the class, Graham Duncan, once posted a photograph on social media a few years ago of an actual advertisement for the Socialist Party of Richland County, South Carolina. Yes, there was a Socialist Party right here in this very city circa 1914. And I note that not just because it's kind of a cool factoid, but it shows you how the socialist movement was a truly national movement. It wasn't just in the North. Granted, it was a bit weaker in the South, but there were debates among socialists about how to grow the party. Now, of course, the best known socialist of his day was Eugene Debs, who runs for president several times as the Socialist Party nominee, including running for president from jail in 1920, a fact that's been brought up a lot lately for some strange reason. But, okay, so I can get some of you guys. But okay, so anyway, but within the socialist movement, there are arguments about the role of race within socialist politics. Hubert Harrison, a man you see on the right-hand side of the screen, was one of the early leading Black socialists who was pressing Debs and others in the party to create a true grassroots movement. Now, Harrison from New York, he was originally from the Virgin Islands, in fact, grew up in New York. He eventually tries to build a grassroots left movement in the South. He actually gives speeches and talks in Virginia, other parts of the South, in an attempt to build a true grassroots movement. He kind of predates what you see with, say, Ella Baker at NAACP or other grassroots organizers in the mid to late 20th century by decades. Harrison sees the South as being integral to this process, arguing that Black and white workers in the South would be an important part of any long-term socialist movement strategy. I want to go ahead and end tonight's class with this gentleman. We've talked this semester about John C. Calhoun, about multiple Wade Hamptons, about Ben Tillman, but I would submit to you that perhaps the most underrated politician in the history of our state is Cole Blees, gentleman you see. Now, say what you will about Ben Tillman, and there's a lot that we can still say about him. But historians would argue that Tillman at least had some sort of ideology based primarily around white farmers and white farming interests in South Carolina. Blees, on the other hand, when he ran for governor in the 19-teens, essentially ran an openly white supremacist campaign that was based on nothing more than hatred of African Americans. Blees's voting base was actually white workers in the growing textile mill industry in South Carolina. And Blees promised to those white textile workers that he would be their champion in Columbia if elected governor. He railed against the wealthy interests in Charleston, politicians in Columbia, and the Negroes across the state. And Blees won several terms as governor of South Carolina. However, Blees at the same time angered and alienated other members of the Democratic Party, which by the early 20th century had become either pro or anti-Ben Tillman. Tillman and Blees, in fact, were not the greatest of allies in the early 20th century. This despite Tillman being in the US Senate by this point, and Blees really becoming sort of the forefather of other more famous politicians in this state in the 20th century. But what Blees represents is a strain of really right-wing ideology that is by now pretty popular across the country. An ideology based primarily in fear of the other and intimidation of anyone who would stand in their way.
Cotton Ed. That was his nickname.
All right, so we've got about
That guy's in the mills, working in the mills with cotton. Yeah.
any questions.
Yeah, let's take, surely these people have some questions. out there in Zoomland. Well, I will be sending you some more stuff about Debs. He was Modjeska's hero. When we had a print shop, we printed cards for her that had his famous statement, while there is a prison, while there is a soul in prison, I am in it. While there's a working class, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And she wasn't quite old enough, even though women couldn't vote then. When Debs ran for president from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he got 2 million votes in 2020, and she was 20. And I'll send you something that I'll also send links to Throughline, which is a public PBS blog, and they have series. And there's a series on capitalism, a series on American socialism, and you can listen to it while you're washing dishes.
So I note in the chat, by the way, that Randall Reed had a good point. Something I didn't have time to get to this evening, but I'm glad you mentioned it, about how the populists in the 1890s were often associated with racism and anti-Semitism. And this is actually the point we're talking about here. There were some populists in the 1890s, like Tom Watson, who pushed for a biracial coalition. At the same time, however, there were also populists in the movement during that time period that argued their biggest adversary were the people who were running the banks, so to speak, who were controlled the global economy, who everyone understood to be basically referencing people of Jewish descent. Watson himself is a really interesting case study. In the 1890s, he is pushing for working with Black voters. He even helps to prevent a lynching in Georgia. By 19 teens, he is a senator from Georgia, and he is a rabid anti-Semite, who, by the way, actually argues against American entry to the Great War. Talk about that next week. So again, as Brett has pointed out, these folks contain multitudes.
I have a comment.
Go ahead, please.
This is a comment, not a question, but I was aware of the what happened in Wilmington, in the 1890s, and I'd been doing research on my family history, and I know that my paternal grandfather, Ben Frazier, was born in Wilmington around 1890, but by 1896, they had moved to Lower Georgetown County, South Carolina, and what happened in Wilmington might have been the reason why they left North Carolina and moved to South Carolina.
No, that's a really important point. I mean, as much as we talk about the Great Migration, for instance, there is a lot of migration within the South, partly to escape some of these conditions. Even before the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, tensions in the city and the state of North Carolina are running pretty high because of the growth of the populist movement, because of the fact that Republicans are still pretty powerful in North Carolina. So that certainly could have played a role. Again, there are a multitude of reasons why Black Americans are moving during this time period, and also a multitude of responses they will have on the issue of segregation and racism across the South. Any other question? Oh, okay. Dr. Greene, do you know if Ben Tillman had any particular opinion about Bleasism? That's a good question. So I think one of the things about Cole Blease and Bleasism is that from a distance, he and Ben Tillman seem like two peas in a pod. But Tillman and Blease often disagreed on strategy. They disagreed a bit on what their ultimate objectives were for South Carolina. Again, Tillman is willing to make some compromises, for example, to bring in business to the state, so on and so forth. Cole Blease is just an ardent racist who is really not committed to anything except the continuing disenfranchisement of Black voters. Hell, quick question. Do you see this history continuing to affect the upstate's conservative republicanism? Do you see a time when progressivism can dislodge this entrenched conservative republicanism? Thanks. I think to answer your first question, certainly this history, as you'll see in the weeks to come as well, does really affect what conservatism looks like in South Carolina. And in fact, one of the main arguments we put forward as a school is that you cannot understand the history of American conservatism without understanding the history of South Carolina, because so many politicians, including folks we're going to discuss in the weeks to come, your Jimmy Burns, your Strom Thurmonds, etc., they also have a tremendous influence on modern conservative ideology. And the reason I brought up Tillman and Blease is that those two gentlemen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are constructing a kind of really right-wing ideology in South Carolina that doesn't just stay here. For example, Tillman is one of the folks who is often alluded to now when talking about the current Make America Great Again movement, for example. Some of the rhetoric Tillman espoused in the 1890s has some interesting parallels with rhetoric in the 2010s and 2020s.
But Tillman's role in Clemson reminded me that I know that it was on John C. Calhoun's land, but Tillman had a role in the agricultural.
Right. See, this is again one of the things that distinguishes Tillman from Blease, that Tillman was a big believer in agricultural education, and that he was really prominent in trying to encourage that at Clemson and throughout the state. Whereas, again, an interesting parallel with Blease, I mentioned Thomas Miller being the president at SC State. Blease is the person who forced him to resign because Miller is an outspoken opponent of Cole Blease. When Cole Blease wins the election, he makes sure that Miller is removed from that post at SC State. Any other questions?
One question about Mr. Reed. Is that a squirrel climbing around over his body, or is that something else that I'm expecting?
I've seen it before. I've seen it in the background.
Right there.
A pet squirrel climbing around.
That's him, yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that's a pet.
Yeah, I've seen it before in the background. I thought I was crazy.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Just curious, like a lot of the lineage of these politicians that were so conservative, I mean, are these old families in South Carolina that, come up under this whole umbrella, or are there fresh people coming in from other places that are conservative, that are running for office and things like that?
That's the hope. The people, the comebacks, the been here. Are the ones that didn't make. The comebacks are the ones that come back to help us.
Right.
And they come back to take care of ailing parents. And that's like a generation of people that are, Herb Fraser's one of them. He's really brilliant lad up there. And that one of the things I think is enable the South Carolina politicians to brag about how we went through the civil rights movement without much trouble. That's because everybody damn left. And that they had a reputation for being very brutal. But one of the things that deals with that earlier question about the upstate maybe having some hope for not being so reactionary is the international business that's moving in there. It's this diversification with the power of money. And so I hear people talking about that up there, but if you were old enough to remember Carol Campbell running a really racist campaign, taking the place of somebody Albert Watson, who was stone cold racist, and Carol Campbell led a anti-busing motorcade after the Lamar riot. We'll get into that when we get into the 70s.
Right.
But that was in Greenville County. They turned over a school bus that the black kids had just gotten off of. That was 70, I think it was. Yeah, I mean, not that long
Yeah,
ago.
1970.
Yeah, and so that there's also that upstate was part of the few counties that had martial law during because of the Klan Act. Robert, do you remember the counties? It was Lawrence and
It was 9 of the upstate counties. Lawrence is one of them. I
Yeah.
think Union County was one. I can't remember the other ones though, but it's all in the same area, basically, in the upstate. I used to have a map of it somewhere, and I can't find it right now. But actually, to your question as well, there are some families that come up time and again in the history of the state, like the Calhouns, for example. We talk about John C., but his father was involved with the regulator movement in the 1760s. Of course, you also have various families that are involved, like the Hamptons. Wade Hampton the first is involved in state politics in the 1790s, and his grandson is the one who governs the state after Reconstruction. So you do have some families that come back time and time again. Other families that have ties throughout state's political history. There are some names you see over and over again in state's history for those same reasons.
We have a Sunday dive, Robert, you want to talk about,
Yes. Okay.
Dr. Taylor?
Now, this coming Sunday at 4 p.m., we'll have another Sunday event. This will be spearheaded by Dr. Jennifer Taylor of Duquesne University, who is, like me, a graduate of the University of South Carolina's PhD program in history. And Dr. Taylor's specialty is public history and memorialization. And this Sunday, she's going to talk a bit, not just about the debate over memorials and statues, but the ties between these memorialization debates and the current upswing in far-right groups like the Proud Boys, for example, and other groups like that. Because there are some interesting parallels and connections that she points out in her talk. That's this Sunday from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., right? And then next Monday, we'll pick up where we left off here by talking a bit more about the Palmetto State in the early to mid 20th century, laying the groundwork for understanding both the human rights and civil rights movements in this state, and also the reactionary movements against both of those movements as well.
Well, next Monday, it's Armin Durfner,
Oh, that's right.
and so that's why I'm gonna send some stuff out to pick up some stuff. But Armin Durfner, he is the person that's still alive that's done the most civil rights work in the South, successful civil rights work in the South. He's pushing 90, Charleston-based lawyer, and Brian Burton, who you've been paying attention, you met. They got together and wrote a book called Justice Deferred, and they broke it down, and it's pretty remarkable, but I trust them, that the majority of Supreme Court rulings since the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have been passed have been in favor of corporations, not people, certainly not Black people. And so they've been all over the country talking about that book. And we had to move them around because they presented to the National Bar Association on a Sunday that we had them. And so we bumped the schedule and they're now on a Monday, but it's significant stuff.
Yeah, and their discussion of how these things all tie together is, I think, really important, because one of the things about the Modjeska School is that we want everyone who takes the school to be able to tie all these disparate threads together. I think next week's class is really important, showing the legal side of all this, how it affects the nation and the state in terms of the law and the Constitution. It's a really fascinating discussion that I'm looking forward to next Monday.
And keep telling yourself, this is not a history lesson. This is a lesson about power, who's got it, and how we get some.
But these threads are becoming apparent to me last week, but even this week. And I'm sure Professor's going to really nail some heavy threads that have been winding through the 20th and the first part of the 21st. But it's apparent to me as far as putting stuff together.
That's exactly what the class is about. So again, you ain't seen nothing yet.
You don't have to leave, but we're gonna get up and socialize and wish you were here.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. That was just really lovely. Really well done.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a great evening. We'll see you hopefully this Sunday and next Monday as well.
Be safe, everyone.
Thank you, Randall.
I mean, they gone, but not for long.